like to turn to Romans chapter 12. Read the first 3 verses, very familiar verses, especially the first 2. Romans 12, verses 1 through 3. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that ye present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. Be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. For I say, through the grace given unto me, to every man that is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, according as God hath dealt to every man the measure of faith. Coming to this point in the book of Romans, Paul had spent 11 chapters emphasizing the doctrinal truth of salvation by grace. Beginning with chapter 12, the emphasis now shifts to the practical aspect of this truth. This transition from doctrinal to practical is indicative of the fact that Christianity is not merely a teaching. It is a teaching, but it's much more than a teaching. It's a life. It is a way of being. It is a way of living. The transition from doctrine to practical also is an illustration that doctrine and living are not separate entities. They go together. There's a connection. In our text, Paul is pleading with the saints of God. He says, I beseech you. The grounds of his pleading are the mercies of God. The mercies of God have reference to what Paul has been writing about up to this point. They would be inclusive of election, predestination, adoption, atonement, reconciliation. These are all things that Paul has mentioned. Justification, regeneration, calling, repentance, faith, God's providence, God's provision, God's protection. These are all the results of the mercies of God. It's indicative of the fact that Christianity has its basis and has its motivation in what God has done. It's not in us. It's the living out of salvation. And then coming to verse 3, which is where we want to take the main thought of the message. The opening word is for, or with respect to, referring back to the duty, the obligation, and the call of verses 1 and 2. He says, for I say through, that is, by the means or agency of the grace given or bestowed unto me. He says, I say to every man that is among you, all the brethren, all the saints of God that he's speaking to. So the duty, the obligation of verses 1 and 2 is for all the saints. And then he proceeds, here in verse 3, to use the word think 3 times. He uses it in the negative, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think. So that's twice. So there is wrong thinking. There is sinful thinking that will prevent you from living in what is stated in verses 1 and 2. And then he says, but, on the contrary, to think soberly. That is, to think clearly. To think in an unclouded way. Next word, according. Think soberly according, or in accord and harmony, as God hath dealt to every man the measure of faith. So what he's talking about is thinking in relation to faith. Thinking in relation to faith. So Paul is saying, as God's messenger, by way of warning, do not have exaggerated thoughts of yourself or your importance. But rather than thinking that way, think wisely. Think clearly through faith. And that's our subject, faith and unclouded thinking. Faith and unclouded thinking. First of all, just by way of summary, think about verses 1 and 2. The life that we are called to live. You think of the nature of the call that goes forth in verses 1 and 2. Paul is pleading. He's begging. He's fervently entreating his readers, whom he had addressed in chapter 1, verses 6 and 7 as the called of Jesus Christ, and as the beloved of God, called to be saints. He says, I beseech you, I plead with you. And the tone of the spirit and the tone of his pleading is established way back in chapter 1, verses 7 through 11. And we're not going to take the time to read those verses, but Paul reveals in those verses his mindset toward his readers. And this mindset sets the tone of his plea here in Romans 12. And if you read Romans 1, verses 7 through 11, you see that his mindset was one of love, one of concern, a burden for their spiritual well-being, and a desire for them to be strengthened spiritually. And we need to hear verses 1 and 2 of Romans 12 has a plea of love. It is a plea of concern for our spiritual well-being. Notice that what he is pleading for them to do is unto God. It is unto God. And the fact that he is pleading, and the fact that he is pleading for what he's pleading for involves something unto God, that stresses the privilege, it stresses the urgency, it stresses the seriousness and the priority of the matter. It's unto God, and he's pleading. Also notice that the thing he is pleading for is said to be holy and acceptable and reasonable. That adds to the attraction of the plea. There's nothing you can find wrong with this plea. It's holy. It's acceptable. It should be acceptable to all of us. It's reasonable. It just makes sense. So what we read here is a plea of one under the inspiration and the influence and the impulse and the leading of the Holy Spirit. And we need to hear it as such. The life that he pleads for is very personal. And that is seen from the repeated pronouns you, ye, and your. So what is stated here is not just the duty and the obligation of a few, but each and every one of us that know the Lord. And it's all done unto God. It's all done for God. Unto God. Unto God. It's not about us. It's not about what's pleasing to us. It's unto God. So it is a duty that involves losing sight of ourselves and being completely absorbed with God. That's to be our life. That's the life that we're being called to here. It is a life that involves total dedication. As you read the verses, there is a spirit of readiness and cheerfulness. And this is voluntary, indicated by the word present. We are to present. We are to do so readily, cheerfully. He pleads present. Surrender. Yield. Offer your bodies a living sacrifice unto God. Surrender unto God. Yield unto God. Offer unto God. That unto God is key in this life. And this is in gratitude for the mercies of God. So he's saying, give yourselves. Be ready to give yourself. Do so cheerfully. Give yourself in all that you have to God. To God. It is absolute surrender. Absolute commitment. Absolute devotion and dedication. Absolute allegiance to God. And it's on the grounds of the mercies of God. So, in this, we acknowledge God's right upon our lives. God's claim upon our lives. God's right, God's claim upon our entire being. Upon our entire life. And that God is to be the focus. He is to be the purpose of our lives. It means that we are set apart, we are reserved, we are surrendered to the Lord. And this is motivated and spawned by the riches of His grace bestowed upon us. Present your bodies a living sacrifice unto God. It's a plea. It's a fervent and earnest call for the saved to hand over their lives to the Lord. To give up their lives to the Lord. To let go of their lives. To relinquish all possession and claim upon their lives. A call to commit, a call to dedicate and to submit, and confine the totality of our being to God. It is a complete and entire resignation of ourselves to God. It's placing our lives on the altar of sacrifice. It is considering our lives to be sacred unto God. And He's pleading for such out of love and concern for their spiritual well-being. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice unto God. That's far-reaching. That's extensive. It requires our life, our bodies, our minds, our soul, our very being. It is inclusive of every aspect of our life, of every detail and every circumstance of our life. It is you and I recognizing that there is nothing in my life that is to be off limits to God. Nothing in my life is to be excluded from God. We see also that it is a life that involves separation. He says in verse 2, be not conformed to the world. That is, be not fashioned in accordance with the world. So it is a life resisting and living above the philosophies and the reasonings and the ways and the pursuits and the ideas of the world. Be not conformed to the world. That is, we're not to be cast into the mold of the world. Also, it is a life that involves an inner transformation. Verse 2, but be ye transformed. Be not conformed to the world, but be ye transformed, changed. And how does it take place? By the renewing of your mind. So the mind has a part of this. The renewing of your mind. That is, we're to have new views, new feelings. It's a big problem when God's people have the same views as the world. Big problem. Has the same feelings. That's a problem. That's a hindrance to the life that we're called to live. It is a life that is continual. In verse 2, everything is present tense. The word be is used twice. Once in the negative, be not conformed. That is, be not conformed again and again, not fashioned and influenced by the world. And from the positive, be ye transformed again and again, anew every day. So from all of this, we see some specific traits of true Christian living. It is devotion and commitment to God. It is a life that is all-encompassing. It is a life of self-relinquishment. It is a life set apart for God. It is a life according to God's way, acceptable unto God. Acceptable unto God. It is a life according to God's way. It is a life in the direction of God, unto God. It's easy to see that it's a life of reverence to God. It's an exaltation of God. It is a very peculiar life. And it is a life separate from the world, a life of transformation, a life of renewal. A life that shows and demonstrates and displays the approved will of God. And our main thought is the thinking that is necessary to such a life. People's thought patterns interest me greatly, have for a long time. How did you get here? How did you get to this thought? Just didn't happen, you got there. And it's interesting how people get there. We can get to the same conclusion, you and I, but we may not get there the same way. We may go about it an entirely different way, but we get to the same conclusion. So thought patterns, very interesting. How people think, very interesting. Not only interesting, sometimes scary, but how people think. Because our thinking, there is a way of thinking that is necessary to this life that we've just described. It involves a thought process. The mind is very important. It is a life that involves, first of all, an overcoming of a wrong mindset. If you have any problem whatsoever with Romans 12, 1 and 2, if you have any resistance to Romans 12, 1 and 2, it's because you have a wrong mindset. It's because you're not thinking right. In verse 2, he speaks in connection with this life that we're being called to live, the renewing of your mind. So the mind has a part. And in verse 3, we've already said that 3 times he uses the word think. Think. The word think has to do with our view of something. It has to do with being under a certain impression. The word think means what we suppose. Well, I suppose. Well, how'd you get there? How did you get to your supposition? Well, it's through a thought process. To think is to reason. To think is to determine. And we all get there by thinking. It is a word that speaks of the way that we judge a situation or a person, the way we regard matters, the manner in which we estimate things, all has to do with thinking. It is a word that speaks of how we imagine. Well, people imagine some pretty wild things, pretty unreasonable things. It's how we visualize, think. So from verse 3, we see that there is a wrong way to think. Not to think of himself more highly than he ought. So that's a mindset that is being condemned. It's prideful thinking. It is basically a mindset of self. That's wrong thinking. It's a preoccupation with self. That's wrong thinking. It's the service of self. We're not to think more highly of ourselves than we ought. It's what he's condemning here is the elevation of self in one's mind. One can speak words of humility, but that doesn't mean they're humble. Their mind may be thinking something completely else, different. So this elevation of self in one's mind is in direct opposition to everything stated in verses 1 and 2. You can be sure of this: the mindset of pride will not permit you to live in verses 1 and 2. Won't happen. Will not happen. It is a life that involves unclouded thinking. Romans 12:1 and 2 involves unclouded thinking. So there's a rebuke of a certain mindset, not to think, but notice, but to think. Not to think, but to think. And what follows is the mindset we need to live in Romans 12:1 and 2. And notice what it says. It says that we are to think soberly. We're to think soberly. That is, our thought process is not to be under the influence of that which is contrary to verses 1 and 2. Think soberly. This has to do with clear and unclouded thinking. Clear thinking. The reason that so many of God's people, and we all do, to varying degrees, fail to do and live in verses 1 and 2 is because they're drunk. They're not sober in their mind. Their mind is intoxicated with the world and self. And that'll keep you out of verses 1 and 2. I've had people argue with me about the life that is pleaded for in verses 1 and 2. The very fact that you would argue that, you are stating, I am drunk out of my mind. I'm not thinking right, but I want you to listen to what I have to say. That's basically what they're saying. Their mind is clouded. If you have any problems with verses 1 and 2, your mind is clouded. You're not thinking right. What is presented in verses 1 and 2 is reasonable service. But those who are not sober, they're not reasonable. You can't reason with them. Sober thinking is absolutely necessary to verses 1 and 2. Right thinking will cause one to see the absolute necessity of living in verses 1 and 2. People will read verses 1 and 2 or heard it read or heard it preached, and they'll say, well, you've given me something to think about. Well, that's not good. Because you're going to cloud your mind with other things. There's really nothing to think about. It's pretty plain. Present yourself to God. Well, you've given me something to think about. Nothing to think about. Not if you're thinking clearly. Right thinking will fill us with a longing for verses 1 and 2. Will fill us with a passion. That's where I want to live. Verses 1 and 2. Any kind of thinking that leads you away in any degree from verses 1 and 2 is wrong thinking. You're not thinking right. What is the root of right thinking? Thought processes have a root. They go back somewhere. They're connected to something. Think soberly, according, or in harmony, connected to, as God hath dealt to every man the measure of faith. So now we have a direct correlation between think soberly and faith. There's now a direct correlation between the two. Thinking clearly and faith. Thinking in an unclouded way and faith. So the key word here is faith. And the antithesis of faith will keep you out of verses 1 and 2. The antithesis is walk by sight. That's a wrong way of thinking. That's a wrong way of judging. And it will keep you out of verses 1 and 2. We read in 2 Corinthians 5 verse 7, we're to walk by faith, not by sight. So we have a contrast between faith and sight. To walk by sight is to judge matters merely by way of the carnal. It is to be governed and shaped by the temporal. That is walking by sight. Faith is just the opposite. Faith says, yes, I see all the temporal, but that's not what controls me. That's not how I judge things. That's faith. We're to think soberly. When we think soberly, there's nothing unreasonable about Romans 12, 1 and 2. Think soberly according as God hath dealt to every man the measure or the extent of faith. So this life has much to do with the extent of our faith. And it's related to the renewing of your mind in verse 2. So the way to think right is faith. That's the way to think right. That is the way to think in an unclouded way. It's the way to think clearly. We like to muddy things up. God says, do this, and then we come up with, well, what if? And all we're doing is just clouding our minds with all this what if. And you're not going to think right. You've got to think soberly. All those other things have to be put out of our mind, and we just think faith. Faith. That is to think clearly. Again, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but on the other hand, or contrary, think soberly. According as God hath dealt to every man the measure of faith. So to think soberly is in accord with faith. So what is faith? Well, faith looks away from self to God. So to think soberly according to faith We do not think of self, we think of God. We look away from self to God. That's right thinking. This faith is dependence and reliance upon God rather than self. Rely and depend upon God. No matter what it looks like temporally, rely and depend upon God. That's right thinking. That's right thinking. This faith is unreserved trust and confidence in God rather than self. That's right thinking. You put your faith and your trust in God. Well, I trust my abilities. Well, you're not thinking right. You're not thinking right. We have to trust God. I have confidence in myself. Well, you're not thinking right. Our confidence is to be in God. That is, all the temporal says one thing, but I'm putting my confidence in God. That's right thinking. That's right thinking. You bring in the temporal things, and now your mind's clouded. You've complicated the process. We're very good at complicating matters. I've witnessed it for over 45 years now. You can give a very simple thing. We're going to have a fellowship dinner. Bring what you will. All the complications. It's unbelievable how complicated people make things. And it really, that's how they live their Christian life as well. Bring what you want. There's nothing difficult about that. Well, should I bring burritos? Or would you prefer I bring spaghetti? Bring what you want. That's not difficult to understand. But they have to complicate it. They have to complicate it. We're going to eat at 5 o'clock. Well, what if someone doesn't get here till 5:15? We're going to eat at 5 o'clock. But they want to complicate it. They want to complicate matters. That's how people live their Christian life. God says, do this. Well, what if? There you go. Now you've clouded your mind. You've made things more difficult than they need to be. The Christian life is really not that difficult if you just do what God says. But we like to bring other things into our thinking, and then it becomes difficult, becomes confusing. Faith is leaning upon God rather than self. Faith is resting in God rather than self. Faith is cleaving to God. Faith is coming to God. Faith is fleeing to God. Faith is casting yourself upon God. Faith is letting go. And right thinking is connected to faith. Just let go and give it to God. Faith is embracing God. Faith is just believing what God said. Without complicating the matter. Just believe. Just believe. Faith is acting upon the omnipotence of God, upon the omnipresence of God, upon the omniscience of God, upon the sovereignty of God. This is right thinking. God said do such and such, and regardless of all else, that's what I'm going to do. That's right thinking. That's right thinking. We like to cloud our minds, bringing in all the other things. Well, what if this happens? Then you do what God says when that happens. It's not difficult. So right thinking has much to do with our measure of faith. So if we're not thinking right, the problem is a faith problem. The problem is a lack of faith. And people like to blame it on God. Well, God isn't speaking clearly to me. Oh, yes, He is. God always speaks pretty clearly. You've just clouded your mind with too many other things. You're not thinking soberly. This faith makes spiritual matters material. I mean, it makes spiritual matters reality. It gives meaning and significance to what God says. And that's crucial if we're going to think clearly. We cloud our thought process when we fill our minds with the temporal. So you see, faith does not merely look upon spiritual facts, but faith makes them real to the individual. Makes them real to the individual. Faith enables an individual to stand upon spiritual matters, upon things that are not seen, and to lay hold of things that are not seen. Faith allows us to think soberly, to think clearly. And I believe it's foundational to truly serving God. It is foundational to living in Romans 12, 1 and 2. God makes it very plain. You give me everything you have. You give me your life. Well, by everything, do you mean everything? Everything. Don't complicate it. He says, surrender yourselves. Well, by that, don't complicate it. Surrender yourselves unto God. Right thinking says, I believe God. That's right thinking. Then you just do it. So it's in harmony with faith. Again, in verse 3, two statements representing two thought processes. The first, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think. There's the thought process of self. It's irrational. It's delusional thinking. And it'll keep you out of Romans 12, 1 and 2. It'll make your life more complicated. The other thought process is again introduced by the conjunction but, and is in accord with faith. Faith always draws an individual toward God. Faith never, ever draws you away from God. Faith always draws unto God. That can't be said of our thinking. Much of our thinking draws us away from God. Well, that's not thinking by faith. That's not faith thinking. Faith thinking will always draw you to God. Always. Always. So we can judge everything. Here's God. Here's me. Am I going away from God in my thought process, or I'm going toward God? If you're going away from God, it's wrong. It's wrong. Well, just for a little while, it's wrong. Faith thinking will always lead you to God. Will always draw you closer to God. And then you know I'm thinking right. I'm thinking right. Any other kind of thinking is delusional. If you think that you can move away from God and things are going to be better, you are delusional. It's never worked for anyone. You're not going to be the first. Self and God must be in proper perspective if we're going to think soberly. So we need to join in with the apostles in Luke 17:5. Lord, increase our faith. Because it helps us think right. It helps us think clearly. Faith. Faith. When we look at all the other things, that's when we begin to have clouded thinking. Things aren't clear anymore. So God help us to think clearly. Brother Stephen, if you'll come and lead us in a verse of song, let's all stand and Stephen will lead us